There's a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It lives behind the eyes, in the hollow space between what a man once was and what he fears he will become. In the autumn of 1931, that hunger had settled over America like a fog that would not lift, like smoke from fires that burned not with warmth, but with the last remnants of everything people had built and believed and borrowed against. The breadlines stretched around city blocks in places where, 3 years earlier, men in fine suits had walked with the easy confidence of those who believed the future owed them something. Now the future had collected its debt, and it had collected it all at once. And the men in those lines wore the same hollow expression whether they had once been bankers or bricklayers, because poverty is the great equalizer, and it equalizes downward, always downward, never up. It was into this landscape of desperation and broken faith that a man named Elias Cord appeared, as if conjured from the very atmosphere of need itself. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in any conventional sense. He stood perhaps 5 feet 9 inches in worn leather shoes that he polished every morning with the same religious devotion that other men reserved for prayer. His suits were threadbare at the elbows, but pressed with extraordinary care. His face was angular, weathered in the way of a man who has slept outdoors more than he has let on, with eyes the color of deep river water, brown and shifting and impossible to read with any certainty. He had the voice of someone who had once been trained to sing in a church choir, but had somewhere along the way decided that salvation was a product better sold than given freely. Nobody knew exactly where Elias Cord came from, and this was, as it turned out, entirely by design. He would say Pittsburgh when pressed, then mention a detail about the steel mills that suggested he had never actually been inside one. He would reference a deceased father in Cincinnati and an education in Boston that left no traceable record. He was a man assembled from borrowed biographies, stitched together with enough plausible detail to withstand casual scrutiny, but not the kind of sustained examination that desperation rarely permits. Desperate people do not investigate. Desperate people listen. And in the winter of 1931, in a rented room above a dry goods store in Akron, Ohio, Elias Cord began to talk. What he described in those early days, to small groups gathered around a kerosene heater in that low-ceilinged room, was something he called the Providence Circle. The name itself was chosen with surgical precision. Providence implied divine intention, the suggestion that what was happening was not merely financial but cosmological, that God himself had arranged for these particular people in this particular room to be the recipients of something extraordinary. Circle implied equality, community, the absence of hierarchy, the sense that everyone was held within the same embrace. It was a masterpiece of nomenclature, and Elias Cord had spent considerable time arriving at it. The mechanics of the Providence Circle were, on their surface, almost beautiful in their simplicity. Each new member contributed $25 to enter. $25 was not a trivial sum in 1931. It represented, for many of the men and women in that room, 2 weeks of whatever intermittent work they could find, or the carefully hoarded savings from selling household possessions piece by piece. Cord knew this. He had calibrated the entry price with the same precision he applied to everything, because an amount too small would signal worthlessness, and an amount too large would shut out the very population he needed. $25 sat precisely at the edge of painful possibility, close enough to reach, but far enough away to feel like sacrifice. And sacrifice, Cord understood, creates psychological investment. What costs you something feels real. What feels real, you defend. Once inside the circle, a member was given what Cord called a position, a number on a hand-drawn chart that he produced from a leather satchel with the ceremony of a man revealing scripture. The chart showed 8 positions arranged around a central point, like spokes on a wheel or petals on a flower, depending on how romantic your inclinations ran. Each position corresponded to a tier of membership, and as new members joined and brought in their own $25 contributions, the existing members moved inward toward the center. When you reached the center, you collected $200 and exited the circle, free to rejoin at the outer ring if you chose, to begin the journey inward again. The mathematics, presented on that chart with its neat lines and numbered positions, made it look inevitable. It looked like gravity. It looked like something that simply could not fail to happen. Cord was careful in those first weeks to ensure that it did happen. He had seeded the operation with a handful of Confederates, men he had recruited in the previous months from the particular ecosystem of the nearly broke and nearly honest that populated every city in America. These men entered the circle early, moved through it with engineered speed as Cord quietly subsidized their progression from his own pocket, and collected their $200 in public, in front of new members, with expressions of stunned gratitude that had been rehearsed until they looked entirely spontaneous. Nothing sells an invisible product like visible proof, and the $200 placed in the trembling hands of a man who had entered with 25 was the most powerful advertisement that had ever been printed. Because it was printed in the currency of hope, and in 1931, hope was the scarcest commodity in the known world. Word spread the way only certain kinds of news spread in communities of the desperate, which is to say, it spread like fire through dry grass, with a speed that seemed to violate the normal laws of how information travels. By January of 1932, Cord had moved the operation to a larger space, a former dance hall on Euclid Avenue, whose wooden floors still held the ghost of better evenings, where the sound of shuffling feet during the Providence Circle meetings was sometimes confused, in the dark corners of imagination, with the memory of dancers. He was conducting meetings 3 nights a week. Attendance had grown from the original dozen to gatherings of 80, 90, sometimes more than 100 people, pressing into the space with its frost-rimed windows and the single iron stove that never quite managed to heat the whole room. The people who came were not, as later caricatures of Depression-era fraud victims have sometimes suggested, simple or foolish. They were electricians and seamstresses and former middle managers and widows trying to keep boarding houses solvent. They were people who had done everything correctly, who had worked and saved and lived within their means, and who had watched all of that dissolve through no discernible fault of their own. They were angry in the particular way of people who feel they have been cheated by forces too large and too abstract to confront directly. And the Providence Circle offered them something that neither the government, nor the church, nor the collapsing remnants of the economy could provide. It offered them agency. It offered them the sensation, however illusory, of doing something, of taking a step forward in a world that had only allowed steps backward. There was a woman named Dora Kleinman, who became one of the most effective recruiters the Providence Circle ever produced, though she would have resisted that description with some force. Dora was 43, a former bookkeeper whose husband had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1930, leaving her with 2 teenage sons, a mortgaged house, and the kind of practical intelligence that made her skeptical of most things most of the time. She attended her first meeting with a neighbor who had pressed the invitation on her with unusual urgency, and she sat in the back of the dance hall with her arms crossed and her expression set to the particular frequency of a woman who has decided not to be impressed. But Cord had an instinct for people like Dora, people whose skepticism was armor rather than conclusion, people who needed to be met on their own territory rather than overwhelmed. He did not approach her after the meeting with the eager pressure that his less sophisticated recruiters employed. He simply made eye contact across the room as the crowd dispersed, gave a small nod that acknowledged her skepticism without challenging it, and let her leave. 3 days later, he encountered her at the grocery where she was buying turnips, and he spoke to her about the weather and the price of bread and the way the city looked in the snow, and he did not mention the Providence Circle once. She came back to the next meeting on her own. Cord cultivated Dora the way a gardener cultivates something rare, with patience and indirect attention. He explained the mathematics to her privately in the language of a bookkeeper, using actual figures rather than the excited generalizations he deployed in the large meetings. He showed her the ledger, which was real and accurate up to a certain point, the point beyond which the mathematics became untenable, the point that Cord kept carefully out of frame, like a photographer who knows which angle conceals and which reveals. Dora looked at the numbers and found them, within the visible range, correct. She gave Cord her $25 on a Tuesday morning in February and brought 6 new members within the following 2 weeks, including her older son, which would later be the detail that haunted her most. The architecture of what Cord had built was, in its way, a kind of dark genius. The Providence Circle was not the first pyramid scheme ever devised on American soil. Charles Ponzi had made a fortune and a scandal just over a decade earlier in Boston, and the blueprint of his operation was known, at least in its broad outlines, to anyone who read newspapers. But Cord had studied Ponzi's failure as carefully as he had studied his success, and he had drawn different conclusions than the ones most observers drew. Most people concluded that Ponzi had failed because he was eventually exposed. Cord concluded that Ponzi had failed because he had scaled too quickly, had drawn too much national attention, had allowed the gap between money taken in and money owed to grow too large too quickly. Cord's innovation was to keep the operation geographically contained and numerically controlled. He was, in his own estimation, not building an empire. He was building a machine, and the machine had a specific and limited operational lifespan, after which he intended to be somewhere else entirely. He had a notebook, a small brown leather notebook with a brass clasp, in which he kept his actual calculations separate from the falsified ledger he showed to members. In this notebook, which investigators would later spend considerable time analyzing, he had worked out with precise and honest arithmetic exactly how long the Providence Circle could sustain itself before the weight of its own promises collapsed it. He had calculated the number of new members required to pay out each tier of existing members, and he had tracked that number against the realistic population of potential recruits in the Akron area, and he had arrived at a date, penciled in without apparent emotion on the notebook's final page, beyond which the operation would necessarily fail. That date was September 15th, 1932. He planned to be gone by August. But between the winter of 1931 and his intended departure, Cord did something that he had not entirely planned, and that would complicate everything that followed. He became, in some measure that he found difficult to precisely quantify, genuinely invested in the people he was robbing. This is not to suggest that he stopped robbing them, or that he experienced the kind of cinematic moral transformation that makes for satisfying narrative conclusions. He did not. But he began to do something he had not done before in a long career of small frauds and sideways dealings, which was to learn their names, to know their circumstances, to understand with uncomfortable specificity who exactly would be hurt when he disappeared. There was a man named Roy Atchison who came to the Providence Circle with his wife, Nell, and who spoke during one of Cord's informal sessions before the meeting with a kind of direct, unguarded honesty that Cord found disarming. Roy had been a foreman at a rubber factory before the layoffs. He had a son with a respiratory condition that required medicine they could no longer reliably afford. He was not a man given to self-pity, and he did not narrate his circumstances in a way that sought sympathy. He spoke about them the way an engineer speaks about a problem, factually and with an eye toward solution. He had come to the Providence Circle, he explained, because he had run the numbers himself and found them, within the parameters he could observe, mathematically sound. He looked at Cord with eyes that were assessing rather than hopeful, and he said, with a directness that Cord would remember for the rest of his life, that he was trusting Cord with something irreplaceable. Cord told him the circle would not fail him. He wrote Roy Atchison's name in the brown notebook that night, in the section of actual calculations, with a small notation beside it that read simply, paid early. What this meant in practice was that Cord had quietly arranged for Roy's position to progress faster than the legitimate mathematics would have permitted, subsidizing the advancement from his own accumulating funds. He did not do this for everyone. He could not, and still maintain the reserves he would need to disappear cleanly. But he did it for Roy, and for Dora's son, and for perhaps a dozen others whose circumstances had become specific to him in ways he had not intended. This selective mercy was, in its own way, a kind of cruelty, because it created within the circle a small population of genuine success stories that gave the operation continued credibility even as the underlying mathematics deteriorated. Every person Cord quietly subsidized to the center became another advertisement, another testimonial, another reason for new members to hand over their $25 with hope rather than hesitation. His guilt was, inadvertently, his most effective sales tool. Through the spring and into the summer of 1932, the Providence Circle continued to expand, fed by the desperation of a country that had found no floor to its falling. The unemployment rate had reached nearly 25% nationally. In certain industrial cities, it was higher. Akron, with its dependence on the rubber industry, had been hit with particular severity. The men and women who filed into the dance hall on Euclid Avenue came now from further away, from neighboring towns and counties, drawn by word of mouth that had traveled the way of all remarkable things, which is to say, it had been distorted slightly at each relay, so that the promises people arrived with were often more extravagant than anything Cord himself had claimed. He had, by this point, recruited a small staff of sorts. 3 men who ran the administrative machinery of the circle, processed new memberships, maintained the public ledger, and handled the twice-monthly payouts to those who reached the center. These men were not fully in Cord's confidence. They believed, as the members believed, that they were participating in something that functioned as advertised. Cord had structured the operation so that each of these men existed in a carefully curated partial view of the whole, understanding their own segment with perfect clarity and understanding nothing beyond it. It was a principle he had borrowed, consciously or not, from the intelligence tradecraft that had emerged from the previous World War, the principle of compartmentalization, the idea that a secret is safest when no single person possesses it in its entirety. There was, however, one person who had begun to see the whole. Her name was Frances Okafor, and she was the wife of a Nigerian-born mechanic who had come to Akron in the mid-1920s for work and stayed. Frances was 28 years old, educated past the point that the society around her was prepared to acknowledge, with a mathematical mind that she had largely been required to keep quiet in environments that did not know what to do with it. She had joined the Providence Circle in April of 1932 at her mother-in-law's urging, and had, within 2 weeks of receiving her membership chart, identified the fundamental problem. The problem was this: the geometry of the circle required that for every single person who reached the center and collected $200, 8 new members had to have been recruited at the outer ring. And for each of those 8 to eventually reach the center, 64 more would have to join. And for each of those 64, 512. The numbers did not stabilize or level off. They grew exponentially, and exponential growth in a finite population means eventual impossibility. Frances had drawn this out on a piece of paper, working through the progressions, and had arrived at a population requirement that exceeded not only Akron, but the entire state of Ohio within a manageable number of iterations. The circle did not spread wealth. It concentrated it at the beginning and distributed devastation at the end. She brought this paper to Elias Cord. What happened in that meeting, which took place in the back office of the dance hall on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late May, is something that both of them would later describe differently. And the truth, as with most things involving Elias Cord, exists somewhere in the gap between competing accounts. What is agreed upon is that Cord looked at her paper for a long time without speaking. What is agreed upon is that he did not deny what her mathematics demonstrated. What is disputed is what he said next. Frances would later say that he told her she was correct, that he knew it, that he had always known it, and that he asked her with a directness that surprised her what she thought he should do. She would say that he looked, in that moment, not like a confident fraud, but like a man who had walked into a room and found no door on the other side. Cord, in the account he eventually gave investigators years later, said only that he had told her she was a very intelligent woman, and that she was welcome to leave the circle if she wished, with a full refund, which he paid her from his own pocket within the hour. What neither account disputes is that Frances Okafor left the Providence Circle that afternoon and did not report what she knew to the authorities. Not immediately, not for several weeks. She told investigators later, with the careful precision of someone who has examined their own motivations honestly, that she had hesitated because she was uncertain what would happen to the hundreds of members still inside the circle if she brought it down abruptly. She had done the arithmetic of harm in both directions, the harm of continuation and the harm of sudden collapse, and she had found no version that did not devastate the same people who had come to the Providence Circle seeking relief from devastation. She waited, she said, because she was trying to find a third option. There was no third option. There never is. Through June and into July, Cord's behavior began to change in ways that his administrative men noticed, but could not quite interpret. He became punctual in a new way. Not the easy punctuality of a man comfortable with his situation, but the precise punctuality of someone conducting a countdown. He began paying out more members than the legitimate progression would have produced, drawing on the reserve fund at a rate that would deplete it faster than planned, but that would, in the process, get more people to the center before the collapse. He had, it appeared, made some internal revision to his original plan. He was no longer simply going to walk away in August, leaving behind whatever wreckage the mathematics dictated. He was attempting, within the constraints of what was mathematically possible, to minimize. he could not minimize enough. This was the inescapable reality. The geometry of what he had built permitted no clean ending. For every person he moved to the center ahead of schedule, there were 8 more at the outer ring who would never move anywhere. He was rearranging the deck chairs, and he knew it. And he kept rearranging them anyway, because there is a particular form of guilt that expresses itself as futile effort, and Elias Cord had contracted it. In late July, Frances Okafor went to the Akron police. The investigation that followed was neither swift nor particularly sophisticated by later standards. But it did not need to be, because the evidence was readily available, and the operation was not structured to survive serious legal scrutiny. The brown leather notebook found in Cord's room at the boarding house on East Market Street when investigators arrived was the document that made the case, or rather unmade it, because the notebook contained not only the authentic calculations that demonstrated Cord's foreknowledge of the collapse, but also, in the final pages, a handwritten list of the members he had deliberately moved forward ahead of schedule, with the amounts he had personally contributed to their progression. It was a document that served simultaneously as evidence of fraud and evidence of something considerably more ambiguous. The investigator who first read through the notebook, a detective named Harlan Pruitt, who had 20 years of experience with grifters and confidence men, and who considered himself largely unshockable, later told a colleague that he had never encountered anything like it. He had seen fraudsters maintain meticulous records of their crimes as a form of pride in their own cleverness, had seen them keep detailed accounts as a hedge against future blackmail. He had never seen one keep what appeared to be a tally of his own attempts at restitution, a running account of the moments where the fraud had turned against itself. Cord was not in his room when the investigators arrived. He had left 2 days earlier, and the trail went cold, in the way of trails belonging to men who have spent a lifetime making trails go cold. The boarding house landlady, a stolid woman named Mrs. Henriksen, who later became something of a minor celebrity in the subsequent press coverage, said only that he had paid his rent in full through the end of the month and had left a brief note thanking her for the clean towels. The note was signed with a name that investigators could not connect to any prior documentation, which suggested either that it was yet another alias or that Cord, in his final days in Akron, had for some private reason chosen to write under a name that was actually his own. The collapse of the Providence Circle, when it came, was not a single moment but a process, a long unwinding that took several weeks as the news spread through the membership and the implications became clear. The dance hall on Euclid Avenue was shuttered by court order, the public ledger was seized as evidence. The twice-monthly payouts stopped without announcement, without explanation, without the ceremony of conclusion that the members perhaps unconsciously felt they deserved after investing not only their money, but their hope and their dignity and their willingness to believe that something might still go right. Dora Kleinman lost her $25 and the $25 of the 6 people she had recruited, including her son. She bore this with a stoicism that was remarked upon by neighbors who expected more visible grief. She told the investigator who came to take her statement that she had suspected something was wrong for several weeks, but had not wanted to look directly at it, because looking directly at it would have required her to acknowledge that she had brought her son into something that had hurt him. This, she said, was the part that would not leave her. Roy Atchison, who had been moved to the center by Cord's quiet subsidy, had collected his $200 in June. He used the money to pay for his son's medicine and to make 2 months of mortgage payments. When news of the fraud broke, he sat with the knowledge that his gain had been someone else's loss, that the $200 in his pocket had come from people just like him, from Doras and their sons and their neighbors, and everyone in the rippling outer rings of a circle that had been designed from the start to give everything to the center and nothing to the edges. He went to the courthouse and tried to submit the money as restitution. He was told the legal mechanism for doing so did not cleanly exist. Frances Okafor, whose testimony had brought the investigation forward, became the subject of a complicated public response that reflected the complicated geography of blame in the situation. There were those who credited her with stopping the fraud before it consumed even more of the community. There were those, including several direct victims, who blamed her for not coming forward sooner, who believed that a few more weeks of operation might have allowed them personally to reach the center, a belief that the mathematics made tragically incorrect, but that grief made entirely understandable. There were those in the broader community who directed at her a hostility whose actual sources were elsewhere entirely, whose real targets were the economy that had taken everything, and the government that had failed to catch it, and the banks that had collapsed, and all of the vast, invisible machinery of a financial system that had been failing the people in those breadlines and those meetings long before Elias Cord ever walked through the door. The Providence Circle, in its 8 months of operation, had collected money from an estimated 412 individual members. Of those, 67 had reached the center and collected their $200, a figure that included the original Confederates and those Cord had subsidized from his own reserves. The remaining 345 members had lost their $25 entirely. The total sum collected was approximately $10,300. The total sum paid out in legitimate and subsidized payouts was approximately $8,000. The difference, roughly $2,300, represented Cord's actual financial gain from the entire operation, a sum that investigators noted was considerably less than what a man of his evident capabilities might have earned through legitimate employment over the same period. This detail, more than any other, seemed to trouble people who thought carefully about what the Providence Circle had been. A fraud that left its architect with $2,000 and its victims with a total loss of $8,000 seemed to be, by the arithmetic of villainy, an inefficient crime. There were those who read in this inefficiency evidence of Cord's fundamental ambivalence, the selective subsidies, and the quiet payouts, and the notebook with its list of names. There were those who read in it merely incompetence, who believed that Cord had intended a larger haul and had simply managed his operation poorly. The debate in some ways missed the larger point. The larger point was not what Cord had taken. The larger point was what he had created, which was a space where the victims of an economic catastrophe had come together in a warm room on cold evenings and believed, however briefly, however falsely, that they were participants in their own recovery, that they were doing something rather than enduring something, that the future was a territory they could navigate rather than a weather system they could only survive. The Providence Circle had sold this belief with fraudulent mathematics. But the belief itself, the hunger for agency, the need to feel that you were moving towards something rather than away from it, this was not a manufactured need. This was the truest and most human thing in the room on those evenings. And Elias Cord had not invented it. He had only recognized it and built a structure around it, the way a riverbed does not create water, but only channels where it flows. What happened to Elias Cord after he left Akron is a matter of fragmentary record and considerable speculation. He appeared in a federal fraud case in Memphis in 1936, listed as a person of interest who was never located. A man matching his description operated a similar but smaller scheme in Tulsa in 1934, under a different name, though the operation dissolved before it could be formally investigated and no charges were filed. There is a marriage record in St. Louis from 1939 for a man with one of Cord's known aliases, and census records from 1940 list a man of his approximate age and description living in New Mexico under yet another name, occupation listed as agricultural work, which seemed, to those who knew the details of his life, either a radical change or another layer of disguise. The final documented reference to anyone who can be connected, however tentatively, to Elias Cord is a letter received in 1947 by Detective Harlan Pruitt, who had by then retired from the Akron police force and was living in Florida. The letter was postmarked from a small town in the Texas Panhandle and was written in a clear, careful hand. It contained no confession and made no direct reference to the Providence Circle or to Akron or to any of the names that would have been recognizable from the case. It said only this, that the writer had read a newspaper account of the economic recovery of certain Midwestern cities, that he found in the fact of recovery something that he could not quite name, some distant satisfaction that he acknowledged he had no right to, and that he had been thinking about a man named Roy Atchison, and whether the boy had gotten well, and whether the house had been kept, and whether some portion of the machinery of ordinary life had been restored in the way that ordinary life deserves to have it restored. Pruitt never replied. He was not certain who had sent the letter, and he was even less certain what to do with the feeling it left him with, which was not the clean feeling of justice or the equally clean feeling of outrage, but something murkier and more difficult, something closer to the feeling you get when you read about a shipwreck and find yourself uncertain whether to mourn the cargo or the crew or the sea itself for being what the sea is. Roy Atchison's son did get well, or well enough, The 2 months of mortgage payments kept the house. Roy went back to work at the rubber factory in 1934 when production began to recover. He never spoke about the Providence Circle except once, in 1943, when he was interviewed for a local newspaper human interest story about the Depression years. He said that he had received money from a man he had trusted, and that the money had helped, and that the trust had been misplaced, and that he held both of these things true simultaneously without being able to reconcile them, which was, he thought, more or less what adulthood required. Dora Kleinman's house was foreclosed in the spring of 1933, which was not entirely the fault of the Providence Circle, since the mortgage had been underwater long before she joined. She moved with her sons to a smaller place, and then a smaller one still, and she rebuilt in the slow, relentless way of people who do not have the option of not rebuilding. Her son, the one she had brought into the circle, became an accountant, which seemed to those who knew the story like either bitter irony or perfect logic, depending on your orientation. Frances Okafor continued to live in Akron. She worked for 30 years as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing firm that had the good sense to hire her, and the additional good sense not to inquire too closely into her educational background. She is the only major figure in the story of the Providence Circle who left a written account of her experience, a 12-page typescript that she gave to a local historical society in 1971, nearly 40 years after the events it describes. In it, she writes with great care and very little sentiment about the mathematics of the circle, about the meeting with Cord in the back office of the dance hall, about the weeks she waited before going to the police. She describes the look on Cord's face when she placed her paper on the table in front of him. She says it was the face of someone who was not surprised. She says that in the long time she spent thinking about that afternoon, she came to believe that part of him had been waiting for someone to see it clearly, that the fraud had grown too large for the space his conscience had available, and that the notebook with its lists of subsidized members and its careful attempts at partial restitution had been, in some way she cannot make mathematically precise, a request for interruption. She is careful to note that this interpretation does not excuse him. She is careful to note that the people who lost their $25 lost them absolutely, and that their loss was not diminished by whatever private drama the fraudster may have been conducting. She is careful, Frances Okafor, in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime in a world that punished carelessness in people like her with a severity it never applied to people like Elias Cord. But at the very end of the 12 pages, in the final paragraph, she writes one sentence that has stayed with everyone who has read the document since. She writes that the Providence Circle, for all its cruelty and all its false mathematics, had put 400 people in a warm room on cold evenings during the worst years of the worst decade of the worst economic catastrophe in the history of the modern world, and that in the brief time before everything came apart, they had looked at each other across the circle with the particular expression of people who believe they are about to be saved. She does not say this makes it acceptable. She does not say this makes it forgivable. She only says it happened, and that the expression on those faces was real, even when the mathematics behind it was a lie, and that she has thought about this more than she has thought about almost anything else in her long and careful life. The hunger behind the eyes, she writes, the hunger that has nothing to do with food, was the real thing that Elias Cord was selling. And it was, she concludes, the one thing he did not invent.